dye cotton yarn with food coloring or acid dyes? No! This is something that I have exclaimed over and over and over in my videos. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to try out a new kind of modified cotton to see if it can stand up to the claims that you can actually dye it with food coloring. Yes, my mind is blown and I'm also skeptical, but I mean, we're gonna try this out. We have to try this out. I have some Dyelishus cotton yarn, and we're gonna go take a look at the website in a moment. And I mean, we're gonna try to dye it with KoolAid, because that's what we do here. So right here I have 50 grams of it skeined up. I also have a cone in a slightly thicker form, a 1 pound cone of the Dyelishus Easy Dye cotton yarn. So cellulose fibers can be hard to dye, often involve like a lot of rinsing, and it's not as simple as say wool can be. Just because with wool you just need a little bit of acid and some food coloring and you're good to go. And while you might see some staining with food coloring on cotton yarn, if you've ever spilled KoolAid or fruit punch or something on a white shirt, you're probably going to have a stain. But the colors that we got in that staining don't even compare to the vibrancy that we can get in wool. And so for that reason, I'm always like, you can't dye cotton with food coloring. So we're going to go to the website, we're going to read the instructions, and then we're going to try to dye this Dyelishus cotton yarn. But as a control, I also have some KntiPicks Dishy yarn, which is 100% cotton. So, I mean, yeah, we'll set up 2 pots and we'll just, I guess, see what happens. Interesting, there's a barcode on here, which we'll look at. But so dyeing Dyelishus cotton. Oh goody, it has instructions. The skein is tied. The cotton must be washed in hot soapy water to remove sizings and a fugitive tint, which I think that I read that they apply that so that way you can tell the difference between the Dyelishus and other cotton. Use fiber reactive acid, including food coloring, direct or natural dyes. Mix dye stuffs plus warm water only. No other chemicals needed. Does that mean that we don't need the vinegar or citric acid? Warm water, rinse. And then rinse dry and you're done. Hey guys, so here is the yarn that I purchased. I do want to point out that the listing says that it's 100 grams and what I received was 50 grams, but I just called Woolery and they are going to ship me more yarn and hopefully they will have changed the listing. So now that the video is out, we can check to make sure that they've actually done that. But what we will be dyeing today isn't from the cone. I'm going to dye one of the skeins that I purchased. So it is a 10-2 cotton yarn skein. The one I have is 50 grams, and it says that it should hold dyes without the extra use of chemicals, which again, we'll check their website in a second. I'm going to use KoolAid. So there's going to be citric acid in there, but we will see. I have multiple skeins, so we can test this a few times. It behaves as though it's been scoured and mordanted, but we do have to wash it first. I guess it's supposed to take up color better. So the listing on Woolery does not say how to use it. It does say to use 1/4 or less of the dye as instructions suggest. I am not sure. Eventually I have enough of this that we will try it with fiber reactive dyes or tie-dye or something like that. That'll come at some point, not in this video. That will come though. So what I don't know, usually when you're dyeing with fiber reactive dyes, you need to use a lot of dye and there's a lot of excess. If you use less dye, you'll get a less saturated color and you still have rinsing to do. So maybe whatever the treatment is here, the fiber content isn't on the label. I do want to point out that it says this blend, it's 50% easy dye cotton and 50% natural organic cotton. Let's see what the I think the supplier website says. So it's an undyed cotton that's been pre-treated to attract and hold dyes. The cellulose structure is changed which it said before, there's no chemical added to the fiber. So I guess, and this is me being suspicious, there had to have been a chemical added to the fiber if they changed the chemical structure of it. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't still chemical in the fiber, but they did have to treat it with something, because how else would they have changed the structure? So just throwing that out there. So, okay, so here's the claim. The Dyelishus cotton, woven side by side with untreated cotton, the Dyelishus cotton yarn will accept the dye, and untreated cotton may stay white or take on a pale tint. And that pale tint is what we've seen when we've tried dyeing cotton with food coloring in the past. It still took something, but most of the color that we did rinsed out. Using it on untreated cotton allows the development of the woven pattern. Okay, what dyes to use? Acid dyes, including food coloring. Okay, then they say direct dyes, fiber reactive dyes, natural dyes, union dyes like RIT, Dylan, and iDye that contain both acid and direct dyes. So normally the acid component is wasted on cotton, but in the case of Dyelishus cotton, both are taken up. Okay, let's see the instructions. So wash the yarn in hot soapy water, which we'll do. I don't think I'm going to do this, but I guess this might help for wet it. I'm not going to bother washing it in alcohol. So add the dye to warm tap water and enter the wet fiber. You need much less dye than usual. If you're using natural dyes, use the same amount for the wool recipe. For sliver, use half or less the dye package instructions. For yarn, use a quarter or less. So it does not say if we should still use vinegar with acid dyes. There is this little demo here. So I watched the video that they had on the website, and they had 3 samples. Cochineal, which was a natural dye, they used food coloring, and then they had a fiber reactive dye. And the food coloring was actually this green one right there. And from the little vials, it looked like that was probably McCormick's neon green, even though they didn't give a, even though they didn't say what it was, I just recognized it. And so maybe we will try that. I want to try KoolAid first because that's how I got my start dyeing. But if I am underwhelmed with the results with KoolAid, then we will try, say, a McCormick's neon color, since they did get some results there. And she did not add any acid. And what she said was there's no need to add any other chemicals because the chemicals are already in the yarn. But they've also said that the yarn has no chemicals added to it. So, I think it's going to work, but I've got some skepticism here, as you can see, because, like, you know, what did they treat it with? They had to have treated it with something. Let's see. Okay, will the mordant wash out if I wash it first? No, the treatment is a permanent change to the structure of the cellulose, so there's nothing to wash out. So if the mordant, see, the thing is that they're like, oh, there is no mordant, but they've said, I guess they're saying that it's like it has been mordanted, but there is no mordant. So you can mordant it if you would like to shift the color, say, of natural dyes. So that is good to know. So is it safe to handle this pre-treated fabric? Are the chemicals proven to be safe on bare hands? The structure of the cellulose has changed, and the cotton is put through a chemical treatment. In order to do that, there's no residue left on the cotton. Okay. So, I guess that you could read more there. I mean, I will say that I was feeling more skeptical when it said that, there's, like, you know, without the use of extra chemicals, like, that made me feel skeptical. But I guess they do acknowledge that they did treat it with something. What that something was, I don't know, but it's been rinsed out, and the structure of the yarn has been permanently changed. So I think that what we're going to do is different from what I had originally planned. I think that what I want to do is we're going to wash and pre-soak the yarn. Then I guess we may as well do that with 100 grams total. Then maybe we'll set up, I don't know if we'll do it in a jar, the KoolAid with warm water and let that soak. I'm not sure how long, but we'll do that. So I'll do that instead of, I was going to heat it, but it didn't say to heat it. I don't think heating it would hurt anything, but let's try it first. Let's first try it with no heat, just with warm water. And then we can go ahead and try it with some heat. I keep going back and forth on this. I'm going to save, say, doing the McCormick's Neon Green until later, because first, let's try the KoolAid. I actually am going to be using a cherried KoolAid tub, and you can see some of the yarn color that I've had with that up there. And yeah, so let's go wash the yarn and get ready. That's the plan. As we're about to wash it, I do want to acknowledge something. It said to tie the skein loosely in at least 3 places, not that it had 3 ties. I'm going to add some dish soap already in here. There's a chance that I might want to soak and then wash again. It depends on how quickly all of this yarn absorbs fiber. One note that they did give in one of the videos is that if the cotton fabric is still floating, then it's not ready to dye yet. So you want it to be really, really well saturated. And I have a feeling that that alcohol rinse that they suggested is a way to do that. And I do think it does seem like there's some residue or something coming off. Now, I do not normally pre-wash my yarn. I will pre-soak it and pre-wet it, but I don't normally go through a process with soapy water. But that can remove impurities and help you get more even colors. So we are going to do that, and I'm going to add soap one more time. Why not? Yeah, so I mean, I wish that the website had more information about how they changed the cellular structure of the yarn, of the fibers, so that it can accept acid dyes. But it did look like that what we saw was not necessarily equivalent. For example, it appeared to me like the colors we were seeing were not super, super vibrant. So there is that. Are you floating or are you sinking? I don't know. All right, I'm gonna let this, the water is still a bit soapy. I'm gonna let the yarn sit in here for, goodness, let's go ahead and do 20 minutes. Then I will rinse out the soap and we'll see if we are ready to dye it. I really don't want to seem too pessimistic. I'm actually really excited about this, but I do always want to be careful with claims of companies, and well, I'm skeptical until I see how it works. Overall, I think a healthy amount of skepticism is a good thing, but I also want to make it really, really clear that this is not something I recommend that you do with just any random cotton, just because you might be wasting the yarn or getting a stain or getting something that won't last in a controlled type of way. So I want to make that clear. This is a special treated cotton. Originally I thought maybe it was coated with something, and it doesn't seem like that. It seems like it was chemically treated and they somehow modified the structure of the cotton itself, which is different from having a coating or something that is on the surface. It's actually changing the chemistry within the cotton. So I'm sure that that process is proprietary, which is why we can't learn more. Certainly it's not something that someone can do at home to make their cotton dyeable. And the other thing I want to add is that this yarn is more marketed towards weavers. It is a very, very thin cotton. The thickest one seems to be around like a fingering weight. There doesn't seem to be anything much thicker. So that is something to keep in mind. But as someone who is interested in exploring weaving but hasn't started yet, I think that some examples they did with weaving yarn with untreated cotton and the Dyelishus cotton and then dyeing it after and getting these really cool effects and patterns, that sounds cool. That sounds really, really exciting. So yeah, I mean, the comparison of the two different types of cotton we're using is not the most extensive comparison. Like, I should be, in theory, try to compare with some cotton of a similar weight. You know, there's more comparisons we can do. But, yeah, we'll set things up, and actually, I will probably throw in a third container with some Stroll fingering weight yarn. This is a yarn that we know dyes super, super well with KoolAid, and so I will pre-soak this in a minute. I don't think it needs to necessarily even soak that long, but we will use this as a control with the technique, because if the color's all binding here, then yeah, that'll be some information that we have. Normally, I would recommend that you use KoolAid packets. I think that for the cost and that there's no sugar in them, they are a really, really great thing to use to dye yarn. But I've got this tub of KoolAid. We are going to use this because I have it and I would like to use it up. I would say that, you know, a couple scoops of this are then more equivalent to the amount of dye that you might have in one KoolAid packet. So it is more expensive. There's sugar to rinse out in the end, but it will work. And so it's similar-ish. All right, the water is still a bit warm, which is fine. But now let's rinse out this soap. I don't mind if the color is not perfectly even. That is not something I am worried about. And actually, now that I am rinsing out the soap, I'm going to add my skein of Stroll, which has not really, has not been pre-soaked at all, but I do want to pre-wet it for the projects ahead. And Stroll just soaks up water so easily. I could have added it dry. I just figured, since I'm doing this, I may as well include it in the little process. Not that I usually rinse stuff with warm water, but anyway, let's go and talk about our dye baths. Today I'm going to dye the yarn in these plastic shoe boxes because it'll be really easy for me to set them aside. Now, the tools and equipment I'm using today are actually dedicated for dyeing yarn and aren't tools that I use for food. I am unsure if you need to treat this yarn that way, but because I wanted to use these containers, I don't have ones that I just use for food coloring. So there is that. Okay, now let's set things up. And so for our 50 grams of our Dyelishus, let's do 2 scoops for our 50 grams of Dyelishus. We're going to do 4 scoops, approximately, for our untreated cotton. And then we're going to do 4 scoops for the KntiPicks Stroll. Okay, now I will potentially add some mini skeins of wool yarn to our two of our bins later on, but that does ultimately depend on how things go. Now I want to add liquid to these, and what I'm going to do is add warm tap water, but at a ratio. So there's half the volume in here that there are in the 2 on either end, so that way, if anything is concentration based, our KoolAid concentration is the same throughout. So my plan is to add 2 liters to the ones on either end, and then 1 liter in the middle. Okay, and now I just need to stir things up so it's dissolved, but given that this is warm tap water, it should dissolve really well. In fact, I think the one I added first for our wool is dissolved already. And again, I'm not worried about evenness of color today. This is a proof of concept here that we are going for. So now, and I am squeezing, oh dear, yarn out of the pre-soak. let's add our Dyelishus skein in here. Maybe I could have added more Kool-Aid, but we can add more later on. I have no idea if it's going to absorb all of it. Let's do that. Next, let's do the dishy cotton, which we will add over here. And then finally, our stroll, which has just been pre-wet, and we are going to add this right here. And what I can already say is I think I want to add more dye to everywhere. I am very, very tempted to add more dye and liquid into each of these containers. And you can see where this may not have been as wet, which is amusing me a little bit. Okay, so I think what I want to do is add 4 more scoops in 500 milliliters of water to these two, and 2 more scoops in about 250 milliliters of water to the middle. Okay, here we come in with the extra dye for our Dyelishus, because I want to give it a chance to be a little more saturated. Here we go, adding this to the cotton. And then finally, the wool yarn. The problem with using cherry Kool-Aid is I feel like the colors that you see on camera are not as accurate as what I'm seeing in person. It's looking more orangey in person, and I believe we are going to have some nice tonal variation in here because of where I just poured that extra Kool-Aid on. But I do want to stir things up. In the video, they did not have it soaking for that long. But I do think I want to give it a couple of hours. And I don't know if you can tell, but here is our 100% cotton, and the color that is left in here is very saturated still. In our wool, it's less pigmented now because some has already bound to the yarn just by virtue of it being an acid dye and working on wool. And well, it's harder to say here because it's got less volume overall, but I am going to place some lids on these containers. I am gonna let this sit for a couple of hours, which I know is not what the instructions indicated per se, but I think that that's what makes sense. My hands are already dyed a little bit, and it is still warm. So like if I squeeze out what's in this cotton, it looks like there's color in here, but a lot of it will rinse out. We might see some staining. This one, if I squeeze out the water, I'm seeing a lot more of the pink I would expect in here, which is actually really, really fun. And then if I look at, our wool, I know that this one's gonna work. So I'm really excited. My kitchen smells amazing. And we'll come back later this afternoon to check on it. It's been approximately 3 to 3.5 hours. And they actually stayed warm a long time. I think now, this one almost still feels warm. But let's look at it. So if we're looking at our wool, our superwash wool, I would say that has cleared completely. All of the food coloring is in our yarn. Now for our Dyelishus cotton here, there's still a little bit of color in here, but goodness, that's a lot of color that's in the cotton. I am impressed, actually. I am impressed. And then as for our poor dishy cotton, which actually does look like it got something, there is a lot of color left in here. So I think that this is the first piece of evidence that we are able to dye this yarn at least a little bit. And we've got a lot of color left in here. So, I think what I'm gonna do, I thought that at one point I was gonna put mini skeins in here, but I think instead, let's remove all the yarn and go wash it. And we can wash it together. And I'm probably dyeing my hands some more now. But okay, here is our dishy, which right now doesn't look like nothing. It actually looks like it took some color, but compare it to this. And I think our cotton yarn here, it'll likely retain some color. That is my hypothesis. But I don't know if you can tell the hues here. That looks so much more red and that looks more orange. But cotton in general looks way more saturated when it is still wet than when it's dry. So I anticipate, even though proportionally it absorbed almost all the color that we had in here. And I mean, right now, I guess it does, the white balance is hard. It does look, to my eye, slightly less vibrant than our wool, but I think that it'll probably look paler, even though it did absorb almost the same amount of color. I could wash everything one at a time. We are gonna wash in not hot water like it recommended. I am going for something more medium. Hot water can make acid dyes dislodge, so that is something to keep in mind. But I am anticipating that we are gonna see bleeding as we are. And the place where I anticipate that bleeding is coming from is this 100% cotton right here, which may have a lot more staining than I thought, but even so, I really don't recommend using it. I do not recommend dyeing cotton yarn with food coloring, except for maybe this Dyelishus stuff. So now I'm adding some of that same dish soap that we did use from the beginning. And the reason why, look at all that bleeding. You know, I want to wash everything together, but I also want to investigate if the Dyelishus cotton is bleeding. So, all right, I guess I've changed my mind. I'm going to set this aside and let's just wash the Dyelishus. Because how can I really be fair to this cotton if something else in there is bleeding a lot? So we're on warm water, and okay, there is some bleeding in here, but don't forget it was just in water that was bleeding, so that is not something that I think is necessarily the Dyelishus yet. Although the Dyelishus could be bleeding a lot, it did say to use a quarter amount of the amount of dye that you would use on yarn. And so I don't entirely know why. Maybe because it's not going to absorb nearly as much, but I wanted to try to get something vibrant. The colors in the example video that I didn't play, but was on one of the web pages I was on at the beginning, did have, the example video did have them do fairly pastel colors versus going for something a little more saturated. So we are absolutely seeing bleeding here, which, you know, with the example, when she placed the cochineal dyed yarn in some water, she's like, oh look, there's no bleeding, which is kind of weird to me if you think about it. Because any natural dye I've ever done, even with mordant, there is some bleeding. There is something to rinse out. And the dye bath wasn't clear. So, yeah. Now, the other thing I don't know is if I should heat set this some more, or if having the vinegar isn't, or sorry, citric acid, because there's citric acid in KoolAid, if that's bad. Now, I'm going to set this aside and let's rinse our stroll. Let's see if we're seeing any bleeding here as well. And I'm keeping the water at the same temperature. So it was just in some water that did have color. So we will see, because it's also possible things just aren't heat set. I'm getting some dish soap, bringing it in, because in theory, what, I'm seeing bleeding here too? I mean, normally I would heat set all of this. So, now KoolAid you can use, but I'm wanting to, I don't know why it doesn't want you to heat the yarn. Yeah, okay, I'm seeing some bleeding in here as well. Okay, so this is why I don't know what I want to do. Because in theory, if I was seeing bleeding with wool, I would add acid and then heat set. But I don't know. We don't normally add acid to cotton, but we're using an acid dye. So I don't know. Oh, and I am, you know what? We're rinsing on warm water also. What have I always said? Wash things dyed with acid dyes on cold. Because hot water can disrupt the interactions with the dye. I'm seeing a little bleeding, but not as bad. Alright, here's what I think. I want to treat all the yarn the same. Man, okay. I think I do want to heat set it. I am now going to wash our, this is just 100% cotton. And you can see here clearly that the bleeding, and from using the sprayer on the yarn, I'm not sure if you can tell. Oh, and the water is still cold. That we're rinsing this color out of the yarn. I mean, when I squeeze it, like I just see in the water, you can see the color coming out. I'm going to increase the temperature to give it its own moment. But this one's going to be the big bleeder. And then I think what I'm going to do, oh my god, look at that. This is nothing like the bleeding we saw from the other ones. This is because, you know, cotton is so absorbent. Oh my god. Each time I like go in and rinse and then squeeze, you can see like the color come out in just rivers. Almost separately from the water, because it's like the water goes and then it's sucking that dye out. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yeah, because it's just, if I put this in, I just have some clear water. Rinse out the KoolAid. Okay, for comparison's sake, this is the cotton. This is the wool. And here's our Dyelishus. So this is already significantly less pigmented and is going to be bleeding for a while. With these guys, this is what I think I want to do. Here's a basin of warm, plain tap water. I'm going to come over with some white vinegar, 1 big glug, 2 big glugs. And I'm going to bring over the Dyelishus cotton and our stroll and let it soak in here, because then I do think I want to steam set it. And with the vinegar in here, I don't expect to see any bleeding. Now, you need acid with acid dyes, but chemistry-wise, I'm not sure what is getting protonated that makes things work. Oh no. As I make a mess, but there's no bleeding right now. So I'm gonna let this sit in here with the acid for, I would say, at least 20 minutes while I am washing the other skein. I did rinse out the container before putting this in. Yeah, I'm not seeing any bleeding. Now the one downside is that if the cotton were to bleed, the wool would start to soak it up, but you can see that these colors are super similar. The problem with warm tones is that they don't read that well on camera, but I wanted to use cherry Kool-Aid because it's one of the most pigmented. But anyway, let's go back to washing the cotton. Voiceover for washing the cotton. In general, when you see yarn bleeding, I would not be concerned if there's color coming out, but the color in the yarn isn't really changing. The time to be concerned is when something like now is happening, when you put water on the yarn and color is coming out and the color that you see left in the yarn is getting paler and paler. That's no longer excess dye that you're rinsing out. That's just the dye that you are rinsing out. And so even after over 7 minutes of washing, there is still a little bit of pale pink coming out of the yarn. This yarn is just stained. It is not permanent. It is significantly more pastel than it was when we started. I mean, you know, I'm sure that there's people who would be happy with this color, but it's just a big waste of materials when if you had a tiny bit of, say, even a RIT dye or a little bit of tie-dye, you could get a similar color that you know is gonna last, at least last a bit. So, yes. But anyway, I have decided to stop washing this. I'm going to put it through the spin dryer and hang it up to dry. And yeah, we're going to go heat set the other yarn. I'm planning to go steam set our Dyelishus and our Stroll. But before I do that, and I'll put it back in the vinegar one more time, I just wanted to put this into warm tap water now to show the difference after washing all that cotton rinse out. And I would say after that vinegar soak, I am seeing less color come out here than when I saw the cotton when I decided to give up. So I just wanted to show that here after that vinegar soak. And a vinegar soak isn't going to do anything on 100% cotton that I guess has not been chemically treated. But anyway, I'm going to dip this back in that vinegar water and then go over to the steamer basket. So if you're planning to use acid dyes with the Dyelishus, I recommend still using acid. I mean, you're supposed to use acid with the acid dyes for things to work. And so, I mean, I would follow dyes according to the manufacturer manufacturer instructions. And I guess at some point we can try fiber reactive dyes with soda ash and without, because maybe it doesn't need the soda ash. But the thing is with fiber reactive dyes, and actually, okay, this is my steamer basket. I'm gonna steam set this just for 20 minutes and I'll pop in front of the camera. I see no reason to not follow the instructions that come with the dyes. I mean, it does say you don't need chemicals, so I think I will try this, one with soda ash, one without, and seeing how that works. But the thing with fiber reactive dyes is that you can use them as an acid dye, and you can use them with vinegar to dye wool, or with soda ash to dye cotton. And if you try using them with vinegar to dye cotton, I don't think that that would work. But of course, we'll have to try that on the Dyelishus cotton. We'll have to try some, you know, set it up and have some samples of some non-Dyelishus cotton for some controls. So there are more and more experiments that we can do with this. So please let me know down below in the comments if you would like to see that. I am extremely intrigued by this. But yeah, I have, since I don't know what they did to modify the cellulose and what that modification was, there's no way for me to really hypothesize what changes were made for how these dyes can work and if those changes mean you don't need acid. Because you know, pH is important. pH is really important. So I don't know. I know that it looks like we've got something that's really good, and I'm also confused about just using warm water and not using any heat to set. I know the instructions were very general. I suppose some dyes don't have you use heat, like the Dylon direct dyes. They're cold water dyes, and I have some videos on those. So maybe that's why, because when they're giving instructions for many dyes, and with fiber reactive dyes you can use time instead of heat, and technically you sort of can with acid dyes, but I usually at this stage heat set at the end anyway because I think that that's beneficial. So I'm not sure. I think that I would be inclined to try to follow the instructions that you use with your dyes. Now, I'm gonna have a lot, I mean, I have a cone of this, so we can try that in many ways. We could try speckles, we can try so many different techniques, but because I think that this color really is gonna stay in there. And so I think that it's possible to get something more pigmented than what they showed in their examples, which I suppose there's benefits for just talking about a hot tap water technique, because not everyone has dedicated dye equipment, and so that could make this more accessible. But then you might end up with getting less pigmented colors overall. So I don't know, but I just know that I am excited. I mean, this is new and weird, and I feel like I'm gonna need like a constant neon disclaimer being like, this cotton has been treated. This is not pure cotton. I mean, it is, but this is modified cotton. Modified. But anyway, yeah, when the timer goes off, then we're gonna let the yarn cool completely and then wash it again. And I'm gonna go moisturize my hands. Our yarn has cooled, and now we can wash it. And at this stage, at least for the wool, I would expect no bleeding. So again, I'm not entirely sure, and I'm getting some dish soap ready, why the instructions have you not using heat. And I'm using cool-ish water, not the coldest, because it is 8 degrees outside. But it is not warm, and even with soap, I am seeing absolutely zero color come out. Now, let's keep in mind that the color of these two right now are extremely similar. Maybe the cotton's a hair lighter, but I want you to keep that in mind because when it's dry, they might look substantially different. But awesome. I would say this is great. And I would say I recommend treating your dyes like you would, and heat setting and things like that, and adding more acid, because that did seem to help. But anyway, I am going to finish rinsing out the soap. I'm going to put all the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. Here are the 3 skeins just out of the spin dryer. We've got our 100% untreated cotton, our Dyelishus cotton, and then our wool. And so this is already now looking a little bit paler, and this, I mean. Here is the finished dry yarn that we dyed with KoolAid. And all 3 skeins look very different, even though we had them set up in extremely, extremely similar situations. Most notably, our Superwash Merino Nylon Blend, this stroll right here, looks red. It's a tonal with reds and hints of pink. The Dyelishus cotton is a beautiful deep rose pink, and it has a heathered appearance, which is super, super cool, and I'll zoom you in a moment so we can look at that closer. Finally, we have our cotton, which is a pastel pink, so it's not nothing, but I would consider dyeing this cotton a fail, because even though there is some tint to it, given the vast amount of dye we used and the intense colors that we got on both our Dyelishus and wool, this is a flop. It's a stain, and will likely, I mean, all of it is food coloring, so it could fade with time, but this I would expect to fade with washing and not just exposure to sunlight. Overall, food coloring can last really, really well. My favorite winter hat was knit with the very first wool yarn I ever dyed with food coloring, and it's still super vibrant after wearing it in the sun. But I just don't recommend leaving something in direct sunlight for long periods of time if you don't want it to fade. But I digress. Here's a closer look at the Dyelishus cotton dyed. And I think that the reason why we see this heathering is that this fiber, I believe, is 50% of the Dye-Lishus cotton that has been treated so you can dye it easily, and then 50% organic cotton. And so I think that one reason why we're seeing this heathering is because we're seeing the other fiber that is dyeing this color, so that isn't really taking up dye, and so that is a difference. At least that is my hypothesis. It's also just possible, in addition to that, that the color is less vibrant than our wool, because overall, when dyeing with similar colors, I think that cotton tends to look a lot paler when it is dry than when it is wet, which is something that we did see as this dried. It wasn't that we washed out more of the dye, it's that it's the appearance. Ooh, we got a nice resist because I guess this tie is pretty tight. So, I mean, there's potential. I'm excited to try so many techniques on this yarn. One other thing that I want to note before we sign off is that Woolry did update the listing for this cotton yarn, and it is now listed as a 50-gram skein. However, they didn't change the price, so it's $9.50 for a 50-gram skein, which is a rather large markup considering that a cone of what I think is the same yarn, the cone that I got was a thicker one, but a cone is $26 for 1 pound. So yeah, that's a big markup, but it means that you wouldn't have to wind your own skein. So I think it's expensive, and whether or not it's worth it depends honestly on what fibers work best for you for knitting and things like that. And if you're someone that who can't or doesn't want to use protein-based fibers or animal fibers, but you want to have fun dyeing yarn with food coloring, then this, I think, is a good option. I plan to do more side-by-side experiments with the Dyelishus cotton. Woolry also made things right and sent me more skeins to make up for what I had thought I had purchased. So I want to say I am really impressed by their customer service and making things right, even if I think that the skeins are a little expensive. I have more comparisons that I want to do, including, next up, commercial acid dyes. But I don't think I'm going to throw in non-treated cotton into the mix for these experiments unless I am doing, say, something else that I have planned, doing fiber reactive dyes and treating this with acid and then maybe treating it with soda ash, and so doing a side-by-side with just standard cotton using dyes that are intended for cotton fibers is something that I would like to do. I am, however, getting a little ahead of myself by talking about future projects when I have one that I want to show you in the next episode of Dyepot Weekly. So make sure that you're subscribed to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel, turn on your notifications so you never miss a new video, because this is unique. This is different, and this is throwing everything I recommend out the window with an asterisk, because in general, don't use KoolAid to dye cotton unless, I suppose, the cotton has been treated in a way that the manufacturers say you can try using food coloring. That's the only time you should do it. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you enjoy these videos that I create and want to help support the content here on the channel, go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. It is a really fun platform where you can get some behind-the-scenes sneak peeks, early access to new content, and more. You can read about all the details over there. There will be a link down below to the ChemKnits Patreon. Thank you so much for watching.